Welcome everybody to Cannabis Reality. I'm here joined with Ruth Fisher, who has a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. She uses massive amounts of data to explain how products create value for communities so that we can maximize those markets within our own community, right? And one of those areas of interest is the cannabis industry. Also joining me is Chelsie Spencer, dear friend of mine, who's an attorney at Ritter, Spencer and Chegg, LLC. She's been in the hemp industry for about 8 years or more now, probably longer, huh, Chelsie? And she has been representing all types of cannabis industries and businesses here in Texas. And so thank you, ladies, for joining us today. One of the things we want to talk about is the cannabis hemp-derived market. This market has kind of become a big market, so much so that it's in states that we see where it's illegal or maybe has a very minimal access to what we would call marijuana. Hemp-derived products have become a big name. Shops are popping up everywhere, and now all of a sudden it's starting to become a concern. We've heard from many different states, even federal states like California, who are wanting to regulate them, even go far as ban them. And we're starting to hear that same kind of talk at the federal level. So this is going to be our discussion for the day, and let's start with this. Chelsie, hemp-derived products could be banned in several states, even at a federal level, like we just talked about. This market has been operating since 2018. If a ban happens, what kind of financial loss could a market like Texas be looking at?
Devastating in terms economically. I mean, we have actual economic reports that look at different market subsets. I mean, that's obviously precisely what Ruth does. So we have leading economists who can go in on a state by state basis and literally evaluate the state. So it was done here, for example, on the smokable hemp sector alone. It was I mean, and that was 3 years ago in a nascent industry. And I think the economic fiscal impact of moving those products out of state in Texas centered around $8 to $10 million alone. Now, with the advent of the hemp and THC beverage industry, which I have acutely experienced with, I've done hemp beverages for over 7 to 8 years, and the numbers on those are absolutely outstanding. So if a state does shut down or do a complete ban, which I think is highly unlikely. I think we'll talk about the merits on that. I do think we're going to see some synthetic cannabinoids and other things cracked down on. But yeah, you can't understate the fiscal loss.
So that's a good point. I do know that, and we're going to get into the kind of the details of what a ban and regulation will mean. I don't think a ban will go into place because of the fallout from that is going to be just too much. I think it's going to be so obvious that they know you've had this market around and it's been established for about 8 years or more. How are you going to just get rid of it? And you know you're not going to be able to do that. So Ruth, from a citizen's perspective, it seems like there's more demand for these products than supply can actually handle. And the fact that legality seems to not play a role in the popularity of cannabis. Your research suggests that that if Congress doesn't act on growing popularity of whatever topic, then these micro markets will start to appear in the black markets too, and it'll start becoming what, you know, kind of legal, kind of not legal. Is that what you're seeing? You're seeing this in Texas and other states. Do you find that the lack of legislation is really more of the boogeyman in this problem?
Oh, absolutely. The problem is cannabis is a very new industry, and hemp especially. They're very complicated, and the regulators, I think, my sense is they're treating it like it's something pretty basic, and they think that they can make clean lines, and they're making regulations without really understanding the complexity of the situation. And it's worse than that because, and you see this anytime laws are made, is a law will be made and then people figure out how to game that law. So regardless of how clear it might seem, people, you know, as long as there's a profit motive, they're going to try and make a profit and get around whatever the law is. Now in cannabis, that's, you know, put on steroids because, as I said, all the complexity. So what you saw in hemp was actually very interesting because there's a confluence of activities that spurred the hemp-derived market. You had 2018, they passed the Farm Bill, and they weren't real clear. They said they said anything that's not THC essentially is legal. And this is Delta 9 THC. They were very specific on that. In 2018, the Farm Bill was passed. 2019, there was mass entry into the market, and there was a huge bumper crop. There was huge amounts of hemp biomass from which just way more CBD was produced than the market could possibly absorb. And it was actually kind of funny because you had all these farmers who had this biomass, and they put a lot of it into storage. And the following year, when the 2020 crop came around, they couldn't find any storage because this is all still taken up by the 2019 crops. So there's this massive excess supply in the market. Prices crashed. And people like, what are we going to do with this excess glut? We've spent all this money. We need to generate some real cash. How do we do that? And that's when the hemp derived kind of came in. Now, it's nothing new. The technology had been out there. But if you're talking about CBD, which is generally, or before that, only available in the marijuana market and in relatively low quantities, to convert CBD to something like Delta 8 was not economically viable. But now that you all of a sudden had masses of very low price CBD available, it now made sense to convert that CBD into Delta 8. And again, because the law said only Delta 9 THC, everyone's like, well, this is Delta 8, it's not Delta 9, so it's legal. And so then they put that out there. And that's, as we know, it's creating a lot of confusion, but it's kind of the nature of the market. And I guess what I found interesting is I was just going in and looking at some research and how prevalent is the use of Delta 8. And I found statistics saying 5 to 10% of the total population is using Delta 8. These aren't cannabis users. This is of the total population. And if you look at cannabis users, more cannabis users are likely to use Delta 8. I have some statistics saying it's about 17%. And if you look at the Delta 8 users, they're much more likely to also use cannabis. So there's a lot of cross-pollination there, but even if you get away from cannabis, you still have a very large portion, or I should say a non-trivial portion of the non-cannabis people using Delta 8. So one last thing is the patchwork of laws make it very difficult, because as long as it's legal in some states, you have a haven for manufacturers to hang out in those states, and they'll find a way to ship it or get it to the non-legal states. And that's what we're seeing in cannabis and Delta 8, is the cross-border black markets.
So that's a good question. And I kind of want Chelsea's opinion on this. There was a Dallas Observer article that came out not too long ago that talked about how they went into these CBD shops that were around Dallas area, and they tested products, and most of them came out to be marijuana, or what would be considered marijuana. And to me, when I hear something like this, I feel like there should be some sort of responsibility from the government to take on, because of their lack of putting any regulations to prevent this. When there was a lot of people that suggested that this would happen. Chelsie, what's your opinion on that?
Well, there are a lot of people, I think, who unnecessarily give legislators some flack for what are perceived loopholes in legislation that are absolutely going to be fixed. But you also have to remember the climate. Like, take, for example, here in Texas with the Dallas Observer article, HB 1325 was authored and signed in 2019. Nobody was saying for Delta 8 in 2019. Nobody was selling high potency products. CBD was the product of the day. So the regulations were drafted with a specific eye toward cannabidiol being the prevalent cannabinoid on the market at the time. Then came Delta 8. It reached a huge peak. Then the market evolved and figured out, well, what are people starting to really be interested in? The higher potency Delta 9 products. So now you're seeing the pivot into, well, forgive me, it was THCA for a long time. I think the THCA craze is finally starting to die down. Now we're back to high potency Delta 9. So when you're speaking in terms of regulation and legislation, most states don't have a mechanism to legislate or regulate constantly. You have to have some type of triggers. Here in Texas, we only meet every 2 years. If we didn't fix it last year, or the year, the session year, then we're stuck for another 2 years. If we don't fix in that next section, then we've got 4 years of bad regulations. So it also is a function of legislatures can't know what they can't know. So a primary example is on those Dallas Observer articles. People are running around screaming, for example, here in Texas, Delta 8 is legal, it's legal, it's legal. That is a pure misstatement of the law. And they'll say, oh, well, it's going to the Texas Supreme Court. Yes, one very specific issue that involves an injunction against the Department of State Health and Human Services, not law enforcement, not state troopers, no other regulatory agency, and it solely involves the rescheduling determination they published on their website. Doesn't stop police from arresting you, doesn't stop the state from having a decent argument that Delta 8 qualifies under what we call PGA2 substances here. And you saw the state came out and briefed quite well, I think, in my point, numerous alternative bases for its position that those remain scheduled substances in Texas. Now, whether I agree with the merits on that or not, that is the state of the law until it's fixed. So I would be remiss if I did not point out, and I get a lot of flack from the hemp industry on this, but because, again, we didn't know what we didn't know, and it was just CBD back then, we have no age limitations in a majority of states. We don't have child-resistant packaging requirements. And when you go into these state legislators and hear the testimony that they're hearing behind the scenes, there's this myth that it's big marijuana coming after hemp and it's big cannabis. Yeah. First off, I've been a cannabis attorney for 10 years. The term big marijuana or big cannabis, that's the dumbest pile of BS I have ever heard. There is no such, it's not big tobacco, people, so calm down. What's really happening behind the scenes is the most prevalent voices tend to be physicians. I mean, I sat and watched, it was publicly available testimony, but there's been private testimony as well. Physicians talking about intubating 2-year-olds on the floor, full intubation, because they're getting access to these products that, THC poisoning is a huge risk in that age range. Mm-hmm. So I do not think the industry itself is going to go away. I think there is a big tension between current state criminal laws, and this is across the nation. We do see forward-facing states who are moving toward regulation or who are grandstanding, like California with Governor Newsom. But within the next year, we are going to start seeing sweeping comprehensive legislation, both at the state level and at the federal level for these products.
Dr. Ruth, I have a question for you. Would it be more convenient to have a regulation body that can meet and probably maneuver regulatory compliance within 37 to 90 days versus having to go through a legislative process?
Absolutely. In cannabis, what we've seen just time and time again is every time there's a new set of regulations, they're immediately gamed. And so the law it can't keep up with the markets. And so what we need is quicker response of the laws to help guide the markets. It's not doing anyone any favors that the FDA has failed to provide any sort of clarity on this issue, because now they've ended up, we now have a CBD market, or hemp market, I should say. It's not, as we see, it's a lot of it's Delta 8, but CBD hemp, it's now a multi-billion-dollar market. And if the FDA were to come in and say, okay, we've decided now that we're finally ready to regulate this, they're now impacting, thousands of businesses, probably hundreds of thousands of people involved, both consumers and producers. And it would just be so out of hand. It doesn't help anyone for them to wait so long before they impose regulations, and they continually do that in the industry. So absolutely, I think that they should be legislating more frequently.
It's been 5 years since the FDA, I mean, the then acting Commissioner Scott Gottlieb announced the FDA's perceived prohibition on the inclusion of THC and CBD into consumer food, drugs, and cosmetics and beverages on December 20th, 2018. Same day Farm Bill was signed into law. They had that ready to go. It took them 5 years to come out and say, oh, Congress, we have looked at this for 5 years. Our hands are tired. We can't do anything. You must fix it. So now we're in a stalwart where the FDA, and in the FDA's defense, I feel for them. They are bound by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and their interpretation is correct. I disagree that they have not been shown evidence as an agency that both CBD and THC were sold in commerce prior to the triggering date for those things, what's called an investigational new drug application. So their stance is, because these are active ingredients in prescription drugs, under the FDCA, they are excluded. The triggering date for that is the day that the end of the new drug application went in. For most of these drugs on the market, Marinol, Syndro, Epidiolex, you're looking at post 2007 or later. I think we absolutely have evidence that these products, although on a limited scale, were sold in commerce. We have an entire Ninth Circuit decision related to THC derived from natural hemp from 2001. So it's out there, but the FDA is either not convinced by it or is willfully ignoring it and has said, Congress, you must regulate this. On the next Farm Bill iteration, we absolutely will come out with more legislation. But another dearth on the federal level is, again, in 2018, it was topical CBD products primarily, tinctures starting to come out at that point. The whole Farm Bill is couched in terms of production only, doesn't address products. The ideal was Congress never anticipated that the FDA was going to come out and say, oh, we can't do anything. Products are just, sorry, you're SOL at this point.
Yeah.
So in the next Farm Bill iteration, they will either fix that by some form of, one of the proposed fixes is to classify CBD and THC as dietary supplements, which is a terrible idea. CGMP regulations are already onerous enough. That's terrible ideal. The other is to specifically address it in some auspice under the Farm Bill that would permit these products a pathway to market while ensuring consumer safety. Because, frankly, we all know I've had to back out of a conference years ago because a colleague of mine reported I was due to speak at the next one, and they came back and said they had this guy on stage whose whole chat was how to buy empty bottles from Amazon, mix it in a bathtub in your garage, and how to print a label on your label maker. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? And so that's the level of things that are happening without regulations here, and why we so desperately need them.
Yeah. So I'd like to make a couple of notes about veterans when it comes to Delta 8 and these hemp-derived products. Veterans use them quite a bit. Texas VFW has come forward and said that they support regulation, not banning. I've known quite a few veterans who have moved over some of the hemp-derived beverages because they prefer them over the alcohol. I think also we have to understand that in Texas got 1.8 million veterans, and that the veterans use cannabis as a form of medication for PTSD and pain. And in the VA system, 23% of veterans in the VA system have PTSD or have been diagnosed with PTSD. So when we bring these topics up at Hemp for Victory, when we talk about this in the general public, this affects everybody, but more so veterans, because veterans have a combination of multiple different issues over a number of years. It's a hard life being a vet. It's a hard life being a soldier. With the federal Schedule 3 coming up, or the hearing on December 2nd, I don't think it will not directly impact the hemp-derived products. But moving cannabis, marijuana, let's say that, from Schedule 1 to 3, can that be used can that be helpful at all to the hemp-derived products? Will that speed up legalization? Because in states where it's legal, you don't seem to have as big of an issue. So is the answer maybe legalization of federally, and then hopefully that all states kind of get on the same plane with their own markets?
It's really two different issues. So rescheduling to cannabis into Schedule 1, will be a boon to the industry because the dispensaries are no longer subject to 280E. So you're not giving 78% of your gross taxes back to the federal government. But the impact for the veteran community is that, and it will be a while. I don't want people to get their hope up and think, oh, this hearing's going to happen and then we're done. No. The hearing's going to happen. They'll make the decision. We may have another notice and comment period.
The hearing can go on for months, a year.
Exactly. And then when the final determination comes out, you can request an ADR hearing before that. Whatever way the final determination comes out, there are groups who are prepared to sue on either side. Doesn't matter which way it goes. If it comes down and they say, yeah, we're rescheduling, Kevin Sabet and his gang probably have the filing. They're salivating at the lips to file it.
Yeah.
So when all of that gets through, once the final court of adjudication has heard all of this, and it is eligible for Schedule 3, veterans will be able to access cannabis-inclusive medications via the standard pharmaceutical route. You'll be able to drive through a Walgreens and a CVS and pick up a Schedule 3 prescription. Obviously, companies have to put these things through clinicals, and we've got to wait for some certain drugs to hit the market. They're already there are plans. I shouldn't say, you know, they're quasi in development, because right now the Schedule 1 status of cannabis makes it nigh impossible to research. So while pharmaceutical companies would really love to start getting some of these things into trials and really focusing on it, there's a huge bar to that right now. So putting in Schedule 3 will absolutely provide greater access for our veterans. It will also qualify it to fall within the auspices of the VA benefits. It's a standard prescription at that point.
Yeah.
I don't foresee the VA doing something crazy saying, yeah, even though it's Schedule 3, we're still not going to cover it at this point. And that, to me, is what's desperately needed, because, you know, for example, here in Texas, our state medical program entry costs are really high, particularly for veterans who are struggling with issues such as PTSD. You know, they may not be able to hold down steady employment and afford $1,000 or plus per month just to enroll and get your first prescription.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. I do believe that the legalization federally will start to kind of allow states to get on that same plane, and it may